Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on Leading Others, which focuses on how unconscious bias impacts communication, conflict resolution, and decision making. My name is Ramit Billen, and I'm looking forward to facilitating this discussion on a topic that has such an impact on our day-to-day experiences, and this is both professionally as well as personally. As we go through our content today, I encourage you to look through both of these lenses and examine how unconscious bias impacts you and those you work with and interact with on a daily basis. Our conversation today will begin with a brief personal introduction so that I can present to you my current worldview, and this influences my perspective and would have shaped this webinar. We're going to continue with an introduction to unconscious bias and exploring what it is and also what it isn't. So far too often we connect and associate unconscious bias with only one or two areas, for example, gender or race, and it's absolutely true that these areas are critical components and are essential to understanding unconscious bias, and you'll notice that as we go through the webinar. But there are additional identity factors and various forms of assumptions that also come into play when we speak about unconscious bias. And these factors can include, but aren't limited to, age, weight, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, and education, just to name a few. We want to keep this in mind as we consider the impact of these biases on business practice. We will discuss unconscious bias in action and its impact on leading others. This will be followed by strategies to minimize bias, and I will also present a case study that we will explore together. We will look at the benefits, and a call to action is how we'll close off the content portion of our webinar today. We will have the opportunity for a live Q&A at the end, and I look forward to hearing your questions. I also wanted to note that I do try to incorporate different types of learning strategies and media within my work, and so we do have a few videos embedded in this presentation. So technology is wonderful, and it's allowing all of us to connect today, and sometimes it doesn't work as well as we would want it to. So we have done some testing with the videos, and I do hope that during our time together it does go smoothly. In the event that it does not, which can happen as these things do, please note that there are links to the videos in the slides and you will have access to them. So if you do miss anything, not to worry, we have you covered. So let's get right into it. I'm going to start with a very brief introduction as to who I am and what I'm bringing with me to this webinar. I am an entrepreneur and have been running a business for over 12 and a half years, which works towards two bottom lines, that's profit as well as impact. And so over the years, my social impact projects that help enable opportunities in education in North America and abroad have brought me to different parts of the world, which has challenged my assumptions and truly opened my eyes. So for example, when I traveled to rural Ecuador to build a school, I learned of the complexities and challenges while I was at the ground level. The recommendations that I had based on what I read and what I would have experienced here in Canada would have been detrimental to the community. So for me, it was a huge reality check. Many times I had to de-learn my biases in order to relearn why I was there in the first place. And this experience led to my PhD at the University of Toronto, where I explored how we develop global competencies. What I quickly learned is that global competencies were very similar to the competencies associated with emotional intelligence, which led to my work in this area. I also teach courses on leadership and social entrepreneurship, and will speak to some of my experiences as it relates to unconscious bias. And with that, I do want to start the content portion with the following question. Here's my question to you. While driving on a highway, a father and son are involved in a terrible accident. The fire department is the first respondent at the scene. As the boy is carefully removed from the wreckage, one of the firefighter exclaims, "That's my son." Who is this firefighter? I'm going to give you about 10 seconds to reread the question and to come up with the answer. Okay, so did you guess that the firefighter could be the boy's mother? Or perhaps a second father or stepfather? And if not, you are part of the surprising majority. The other version of this riddle is a father and son are in a horrible car crash that kills the dad. The son is rushed to the hospital, and just as he's about to undergo the knife, the surgeon says, "I can't operate, that boy is my son." At Boston University, researchers ran this riddle by two groups, 197 Boston U psychology students and 103 children, ages 7 to 17. In both groups, only a small minority of subjects, 15% of the children and 14% of the Boston University students, came up with the mom's the certain answer. This encourages us to think about the assumptions that we make around gender, roles, and professions. In the classes that I teach on the first day, I always ask my students, for those of you who do not know me and never took a class with me, how many of you thought that I would be male? So they laugh and giggle, and about 90% of their hands go up, and they say, yes, miss, I thought you'd be male. And I always ask why, and it's always the same answer, and it's because of my name. When they get their schedules, it doesn't say Miss or Mr., it says Professor Ramit Billen. And based on this, majority of them thought that I would be male. So I share this story with you because we do this every day. We have limited information, and based on that information, we make judgments and assumptions. But how many times do we ask ourselves, could I be wrong? In David Brooks' The Social Animal, in his introduction, he speaks about Dr. Timothy D. Wilson from the University of Virginia and references his books, Strangers to Ourselves. In Dr. Wilson's book, he writes that the human mind can take in 11 million pieces of information at any given moment. The most generous estimate is that people can be consciously aware of 40 of these. So if we think about that, that's 40 of 11 million pieces of information. We assess our current situations and compare them to the data stored in our memory, and based on this, we reach certain judgments and an implied reaction. So further, we also assign value to each other, and our conscious mind is processing only a very tiny fraction of what our unconscious mind is processing. And again, how many times do we take a step back and ask ourselves, could I be wrong, and how I'm assessing what's in front of me or who it is that's in front of me? So what exactly is unconscious bias? Unconscious bias refers to a bias that we are unaware of. So it happens automatically and is outside of our control. And these biases, which for the most part are invisible to us, are triggered by our brain making quick judgments and assessments of people and situations. And these are influenced by our life experiences. So they guide our day-to-day decisions and are most prevalent when we're put under pressure or are under stress. And this is because we rely on shortcuts in our brain to help us fill in the gaps. The danger is that these shortcuts may be unintentionally creating unequal outcomes, and this also happens outside of our control. It is a bias that happens automatically and is triggered by our brain making quick judgments and assessments of people and situations. Now, you may have heard of implicit bias, and implicit bias refers to the same area of unconscious bias, and both of these terms are often used interchangeably. In some cases, implicit bias questions the level to which these biases are unconscious, but for the purpose of this webinar, we will use these terms interchangeably. Explicit attitudes and biases are the opinions that we are consciously aware of. So, for example, this could be our attitude towards a specific genre of music or a specific political party. It's important to note that we may not necessarily be open and honest about our explicit attitudes with other people, but the point here is that we are aware of them. I also wanted to note that bias is necessary, so our mental models help us make sense of the world as we seek to understand it. Joseph Ledoux suggested that this automatic decision-making is our unconscious danger detector, and it's critical because it determines whether or not someone, or perhaps something, is safe before we can even consciously begin to make a determination. So when our biases detect danger, then a flight or fight response occurs, and in cases like this, we need those biases for survival. So having said that, many times our biases surface but are not necessarily used as a danger detector. So I'd like to show you the following video as an example, which actually went viral earlier this month.
No, I would argue that this is a triumph of democracy. Scandals happen all the time. The question is, how do democracies respond to those scandals?
And what will it mean for the wider region? I think one of your children has just walked in. I mean, shifting sands in the region. Do you think relations with the North may change?
I would be surprised if they do. Pardon me.
That's right. Carry on.
My apologies.
What's this going to mean for the region?
My apologies. South Korea's policy choices on North Korea have been severely limited in the last 6 months to a year because of North Korea's behavior. Most recently, the use of VX gas in the airport in Malaysia that indicates that North Korea really doesn't follow global norms.
On March 10, 2017, Robert Kelly, a political science professor in South Korea, was giving a live interview for BBC. He was giving his analysis of the impeachment of South Korea president when his children burst in the room. This was followed by his wife, Jung-ae Kim, trying to get the kids out of the room quickly, as you just saw. There were many, many responses to this video, and many thought that Professor Kelly's wife was the nanny and speculated that there was this fear that she would lose her job after this interview. The controversy led to the hashtag NotTheNanny on social media and a larger debate on why we assumed she would be or could be the nanny and not his wife. The couple, when an interview post the video going viral, has said that they have felt quite uncomfortable with this. There was also controversy on how Professor Kelly responded to his child, and it was asked how people would react if a mother tried to fend her child off as she gave an interview. In New Zealand, the comedy show Jono and Ben, there is a spoof on this video, and instead it's a woman giving the interview, and the woman breezes through the questions about the political crisis while caring for her children, cooking a turkey, steam cleaning a shirt, helping her husband find a sock, cleaning a toilet, and even diffusing a bomb. And so when we think about this, and even though this was a comedy video, it really relates to our biases and assumptions as it relates to gender, roles, and professions. And these responses to the video mirror so many similar ones that are currently taking place in schools, workplaces, as well as in our homes. I'd like to shift gears and discuss unconscious bias and its impact in the workplace. We are now going to examine unconscious bias in action. Hiring and talent development are critical components to a well-functioning organization, and so oftentimes the recruitment process is a breeding ground for unconscious bias. Bertrand and Mullane-Athens conducted a field experiment to measure racial discrimination in the labor market. And the study, which included fictitious resumes with white-sounding names, received 50% more callbacks for interviews and were more likely to receive callbacks compared to resumes with African-American sounding names. So in their 2003 paper, titled Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal? A Field Experiment on Labor Market Discrimination, they stated that the amount of discrimination is uniform across occupations and industries. Federal contractors and employers who list equal opportunity employer in their ads discriminate just as much as other employers. What was also interesting about this study is that applicants living in better neighborhoods received more callbacks, but this didn't affect or does not differ by race. Let's also look at interviews and selection. So as of late 1970s, the top 5 orchestras in the U.S. had fewer than 5% women. So it wasn't until 1980 that any of these top orchestras had 10% female musicians, and today some of them are well into the 30 percentile. Well, how did this happen? Many orchestras now use blind recruitment. So in the 1970s and 1980s, orchestras began using this idea of blind auditions. Candidates are situated on a stage behind a screen to play so that the evaluators can't see them. When the screen was used for the preliminary round, it had a powerful impact, and researchers determined that this step alone makes a 50% more likely chance that a woman would advance to the finals. And the screen has also been demonstrated to be the source of a surge in a number of women being offered positions. We're now going to discuss compensation and promotion as it relates to unconscious bias in action. There is a pay gap that exists. There's no secret about this. People who are doing the same job are being paid different wages. And further, when getting a job, negotiating compensation is not an easy task and may not be something people are comfortable doing. This year, on March 8th, Iceland became the first country to officially require proof of gender pay equality. And further to this, the new law requires every company with 25 or more staff to obtain a certificate demonstrating that they pay all employees equally, regardless of gender, ethnicity, sexuality, or nationality. When we look at promotions, specific groups may be more likely to self-nominate themselves for promotions, and others may feel as though they are imposters. Clance and Imes discuss the term imposter phenomenon as used to designate an internal experience which appears to be particularly prevalent and intense among high-achieving women. And they go on to say that certain early family dynamics and later interjection of societal sex role stereotyping, those are the things that appear to contribute significantly to the development of this imposter phenomenon. And because of this imposter syndrome, women are less likely to nominate themselves for promotions because sometimes they may feel as though they are not qualified or don't deserve it. This can impact one's belief in their abilities and also going after certain promotions or negotiating compensation. So we're going to move on to another video that I'd like to share with you, and this also exemplifies unconscious bias in action. The New York Times released a great series on implicit bias titled Who, Me, Biased, which includes 6 short videos. To further demonstrate unconscious bias in action, we're going to watch one of them, which is titled Check Our Biases to Wreck Our Bias.
Let's look at how to measure bias in ourselves and in others. Here's Dolly Chuk from NYU.
We sent emails to real professors in real universities.
They contacted over 6,500 professors at random from 260 American universities.
We sent them an email that looked like it came from a real person asking for a meeting to learn more about the PhD program in that university. But we randomly assigned whether the fictional person sending that email had a name that sounded male or female and sounded white, Chinese, Hispanic, Indian, or black. What we found that is if you were a white male, you were far more likely to receive a response back than if you were in all those other categories put together as a group.
Some of this could be explicit racism, but it's far more likely that in many cases these professors are just busy. They can't respond to every email they get, so they kind of let their subconscious decide for them. And that's where their biases come through. Research shows that our racial biases are often more about who we choose to help than who we don't. And we tend to help people who are similar to us. But you aren't 6,500 randomly selected professors. So how can you figure out where you might be making similar unconscious choices? First, there's a well-known test online you can take that can help show you biases you hold. Or
just do an audit. Whatever data you have, whether it's formal data in a computer or whether it's just data that's sort of anecdotal, look at the data. For example, I met this fantastic executive in Silicon Valley. He takes great pride in being someone who actively tries to achieve gender balance on his teams, knowing that Silicon Valley and tech are skewed heavily male.
So he looked at his professional social network, his Twitter, his LinkedIn.
He found his network was far more skewed male than he expected. So there's a place where he could actively work to shift that, and that's what he's been doing since then.
So this is not a scientifically exact self-audit, but it can still be useful, and you can audit anything. So maybe start by taking that online test for bias. Maybe check out whose emails you're replying to. But you can also audit yourself for implicit bias by asking a friend to observe you in the real world. If you're a teacher, have people look at who you call on most in class, whatever your interactions are.
This video referred to Harvard's implicit association test, which can be found online. It is a great tool to use, and there are a variety of tests that you can take which can help you to take stock. Unconscious bias has a direct impact on leading others. We are now going to explore 3 areas, which include communication, conflict resolution, and decision making. Before I get into gender bias language, I want to briefly talk about the importance of how we communicate. We may assume that how we communicate is interpreted exactly the way in which we think it is, but that's not necessarily always the case. There are many things in play, including the words that we choose to use, our nonverbal communication, as well as our tone of voice. Sometimes we are communicating by not even saying anything at all, which in itself says a lot. What we want to be careful about is how it is being interpreted. We want to be careful with the language that we use and examine whether a language is gender biased. So some examples of gender biased or gender sensitive language include policeman versus police officer, salesman versus salesperson, cleaning lady versus cleaner, master of ceremonies versus host or MC or moderator, man-made versus artificial, or phrases like boys will be boys or every man for himself. In the recruitment process, we tend to use gender biased language, and when we look at things like our job descriptions, we want to be careful of gender biased language because it may be unintentionally discouraging qualified candidates. So I've taken the following lists from catalyst.org, which states that research has shown the following words to be more masculine: dominant, boasting, determined, lead, challenging, competition, superior, decisive, independently, and competitive. Research has also identified the following words as more so feminine. And what Catalyst.org suggests is that we want to make sure job descriptions have a mix of both. So these were the words that were identified as more feminine: committed, connected, loyal, responsible, cooperative, supportive, dependable, trust, interpersonal, and considerate. Catalyst.org suggests the following solution: audit job descriptions for gender biased terms and rewrite them focusing only on objective job requirements. The final piece here is conflict resolution, and this involves finding a solution to a disagreement. When we bring our assumptions and biases to conflict and without understanding, reaching a solution can pose as a challenge. Using empathy-driven dialogue is critical to seek shared meaning and understanding. And what this means is that we must put our own biases and assumptions aside in order to understand how the other is viewing or experiencing a situation. Empathy-driven dialogue promotes collaboration, and it also allows us to learn from others' point of view and encourages us to be open-minded. It allows us to identify the gaps and assumptions that we may be holding. Decision-making is critical to leading others, and for healthcare professionals, unconscious bias can influence behaviors and judgments when dealing with patients. According to Paradise, racial bias is prevalent among healthcare providers, and it appears that race influences medical decision-making of healthcare providers. Unconscious bias can prevent us from making objective decisions that are grounded in reality, and these decisions can result in negative experiences. It can also result in underutilized talent and marginalized contributions by our employees. Cognitive biases are a subset of all of our unconscious biases, and just as cognitive biases undermines decision-making, unconscious biases can undermine our behavior and impact the way in which we think about people that we may believe are quote-unquote different from us. Affinity bias and confirmation bias are two that are well known. In the recruitment process, we may tend to hire those who are most similar to us versus the individual who is most qualified. We may find similarities in the way one looks or dresses, or perhaps an affiliation with a college or university that we may have attended ourselves. And confirmation bias provokes us to look for signs and messages that reaffirm what we want to believe. So these are not only two biases that exist as it relates to cognitive biases, which impact our decision making, there are many, many, many others. So if you see the image on the right-hand side, the inner circle has a list of biases which range from anchoring to pessimism. And this can all have an impact on our decision making. So I do want to make a note that cognitive biases are actually a subset of our unconscious biases, and it's important to consider which ones come into play in our roles, whether that be at work or personally. We are now going to examine how we can address this. Unconscious biases are not permanent, and steps can be taken to limit their impact. And I'm first going to start by talking about some personal strategies. The first piece is self-awareness, and a lot of the work that I do is around emotional intelligence and also global competence. My work is grounded in the 3 U's: understanding self, understanding others, and understanding context. We cannot begin to understand others without first understanding self. And when we look at things like emotional intelligence, the goal here is heightened self-awareness. This can allow us to understand the assumptions and biases that we bring to situations. It can help us to unpack our past experiences that impact the way that we see the world today. Stephen Covey says we see the world not as it is, but as we are, and our experiences shape how it is that we see the world. And engaging in self-awareness through various methods like honest and authentic reflection, feedback from a trusted network, as well as various tools, this can help us to better understand ourselves and begin to address the biases that we might be holding. We've briefly touched on empathy-driven dialogue, and in order to understand others, we must first put our biases and assumptions aside, and this requires self-awareness. By engaging in empathy-driven dialogue, what we're doing is we're seeking understanding. For institutional strategies, we're going to look at processes, and the key here is to make sure that biases are not built into the process. I distinctly remember a peer of mine in my master's program saying in reference to the quote, "If it ain't broke, don't fix it," what she said was, "If it ain't broke, break it and build it again." What would you find along the way? Would you find inefficiencies or biases? Would you find these built into your processes and policies of your organization? And there are also key questions that we can continually ask ourselves in order to address unconscious bias. For example, we want to continually ask, what am I assuming? Also, how do specific groups experience this issue differently? As it relates to communication, we want to examine whether diverse groups are interested in the same things in the message that we're trying to communicate. Also, whether the language, symbols, and examples used in these communications are accessible and appropriate. Are there differences in how diverse groups access or experience it? These are all questions that we can ask as we develop different policies and also to create more of an inclusive environment. We're now going to examine some strategies that we can use. There are various forms of trainings, assessments, and interventions that can be used to help us build our self-awareness, develop policies that are inclusive, and also minimize bias. There is diversity training, which can be effective. However, like most training, a single workshop or seminar is only effective at the surface level. Instead, an integrated approach to training and interventions is needed, and this includes a specialized multi-level strategy. And by engaging in this, it allows us to consider how different levels can experience, observe, and engage in unconscious bias. A great example of specific training is gender-based analysis training, which is also known as GBA Plus training. Key competencies that are developed through GBA Plus training is the capacity to challenge the assumptions we make as individuals, and these are assumptions that may be unintentionally creating unequal outcomes. The Status of Women Canada has a great free online course which provides an introduction to GBA Plus, and I've taken this and highly recommend it. I also mentioned earlier Harvard's Implicit Association Test, and again, this is a great tool to assess our levels of unconscious bias as it relates to things like age, weight, gender, race, and so on. The EQI 2.0 and EQ 360 are great tools to assess our emotional intelligence and build our self-awareness and also understand the gaps or blind spots that may exist. Another piece that relates to strategies is creating concrete and objective indicators. And so when reviewing applications and for promotions, it's important to communicate concrete and objective indicators and also a shared understanding of success. We want to be clear about what it is that we're looking for. We want to write down concrete examples and measure based on those specific indicators. Discussing rationales is also important as it allows for clarity and minimizing assumptions made by others. By being transparent and being intentional about how we communicate to specific groups is a key strategy to minimize bias. Another piece that we're going to look at is standardized criteria, collecting data, and evaluation. So structuring processes can help to mitigate the potential impact of unconscious bias. So one example is instead of having applicants submit their CVs or resumes, have individuals submit a standardized application form. Another example is using a predetermined rubric to assess candidate responses and hiring using the rubric, which can help to minimize automatic bias. What this also allows you to do is collect information consistently and apply the same criteria. Collecting data in the areas of hiring, looking at things like the applicant pool, number of offers, pay, promotions, and also performance appraisals. What we look for here in terms of collecting data is patterns. Are there patterns that emerge when you look at this data and analyze it? We also want to evaluate how our organization is presenting itself. For example, what images do we use in our website? We want to evaluate processes put into place to help minimize bias to see if they are actually effective. And it's also important to note that using consistent structure and clear criteria can lead to objective decisions made by leaders. And what this can do is improve our decision making. So now let's explore a case study. The case study that we're going to look at focuses on anonymized recruitment. Now, anonymized recruitment is the process of conducting recruitment activities using application materials that have had certain identifying information removed. So this can be as simple as removing names from resumes or as complex as removing the formatting of a resume. The goal of anonymized recruitment is to neutralize a reviewer's sources of unconscious bias. So for UTemp, which is University of Toronto's short-term staffing service and is a part of the Strategic Recruitment Centre, they engaged in anonymized recruitment to minimize bias in initial stages of the hiring process. Their program has been nominated for awards and is a great example to examine as a part of our webinar. There are many sources of bias on resumes, and this can include the name, area code, address, educational institutions, places of work, and so on. And so for UTemp, the items that were removed included full name, address, contact information, so the email and telephone number, and reference to LinkedIn profile. The redaction process utilized redaction software and manual validation to ensure applications were anonymized. There were non-redacted and redacted applications, and each application was linked by a numeric identifier. We are now going to examine the pros and cons of this process. Let's take a closer look by examining the pros and cons of the anonymized recruitment process at UTemp. Some of the pros include demonstrated attempts to combat inequity and promote inclusion at the early stages of the recruitment process, an opportunity to enhance this internal practice, and a chance to engage at the forefront of a practice that is in its infancy in Canada. Some cons include extra time required for resume redaction, and also redaction will not remove all sources of bias. A common criticism is that gains in equity during screening do not carry over to the later phases of the recruitment process, so this may not neutralize the bias at the interview or later stages. For evaluation, UTemp will be looking at the race and gender of individuals that were placed in roles a year before the inception of this process and 2 years after to see the differences, if any, of representation of racialized persons. They will also be looking at the percentage of identified groups progressing to interviews and offers. For further information about the anonymized recruitment process at UTemp, please do connect with Anar Amlani, who is the Manager of Strategic Recruitment and Temporary Staffing Services at the University of Toronto. She is a wonderful resource, and I thank her for allowing us to include this case study in our webinar today. There are many benefits to incorporating strategies that address unconscious bias in the workplace. For example, some benefits include workplace performance, creating an inclusive environment, greater understanding, and human flourishing. Addressing unconscious bias can help us to communicate better, understand others' perspectives, and minimize conflict. It can also help us to make better decisions that are objective and grounded in reality, and to become better leaders. I have one more video to share, and this is Google's Making the Unconscious Conscious. As you view this video, I'd like you to think about one thing that you will do and apply back to your practice, even if it's just one small thing. I'd like this to be our call to action.
What would the world look like if everybody were aware of the stereotypes that they have and the biases that they have? When we talk about unconscious bias, we're basically saying our worldview can actually exert an influence beyond our conscious awareness, and it creates ambiguity.
You go to an engineer who's built something extremely innovative, and you say, who do you think your user is? This is where I have the most fun. My name is TV Raman, and I led our work on Android accessibility for 3 years. Write down everything that you think you know about your user with respect to abilities, inabilities, special abilities, disabilities. almost every assumption that you write down on that whiteboard about this is the user I think I'm building for is questionable. Because our various unconscious biases define the boundaries you're unwilling to expand.
These biases, they're the shortcuts that our brain has created so that we can deal with the information that we process every single day.
Right when we see anyone, whether we think about it or not, we are implicitly, automatically making judgments about how warm and competent that person or thing is.
All humans need to make decisions, and so we fill in the blanks because our brains are wired to do that, and we fill in with things we don't know with, past experience. Oh, you pattern map to someone I think I should hire, so I'm going to hire you versus this person because they didn't map, because I can't fill in the blank because they don't look like me, or they're not from my same background, and so I can't see how they're going to make the jump.
Every single person is great at things that you may not expect them to be, but it's really hard for us to see that when we're so powerfully guided by the things we expect to be true in the world.
I grew up surrounded with this conversation about what you can't do and what you won't be able to do. My name's Enrico, and I'm an autistic software engineer. The first time I go through the performance review process, I was asked for 5 strengths. It was the first time that I had ever been prompted to think in that way about myself, and it was really a life-changing moment for me.
When we are working in our day-to-day jobs, we are still making judgments about the people around us, about the resumes we see, about the employees that we're trying to decide, whether to put them on teams or not.
People are very wedded to the idea that they can perceive something objectively, and statistically they're wrong, but it's hard. You become attached to this idea that you can assess something by looking at it.
These subtle assumptions we make about people can have lasting effects on who we're promoting, who we're hiring, who we're putting in leadership positions. We have the responsibility to understand the assumptions that we make and understand the errors that we make.
But it's not just for the collective good. If you take the time to understand more about this, there are things that you can implement for yourself that'll help you develop as a leader and to do your job even better.
It made me realize how often I have a very strong belief that is simply incorrect. When I look at one of these evaluation situations, the first question is, how can I eliminate the sources of potential bias and leave just the data so we can actually make better decisions?
If you're not conscious of the biases that you have, you're just not contributing at the level that you could, and you're not innovating at the level you could. And so your products won't be as good. Your results won't be as good.
When you think outside the box with respect to the assumptions you made about how somebody would use this wonderful thing you built, and when you sort of broaden that perspective as to who you change the world for, you build something even bigger.
Thank you for taking the time to join me in this webinar, and I do hope that you enjoyed it. We truly have only scratched the surface of a larger conversation, and there are so many facets to unconscious bias and how it impacts business practice. I do hope to continue that conversation with you. I want to take a moment to thank MultiHealth Systems and the Human Capital Institute for hosting this webinar. It's so great to see organizations putting learning at the forefront and using technology to help bring people together. Thank you. I am now going to pass it to Holly at HCI, who will be moderating the live Q&A portion. I look forward to hearing your questions and hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, Ramit, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and offering those best practices for us today. We have had just a few questions come in over the course of the webcast, and we will get to those in the time we have remaining. HCI members, if you haven't yet submitted your questions for Ramit, please do so now. You can submit them by entering the questions on the question and answer box that you see right there on the webcast page. So we'll get to our first question of the day, which comes from John. He wants to know, outside of recruitment, where else do you see unconscious bias impacting the business practice?
Thank you so much, Holly, and thank you so much, John, for that great question. When we look outside of the recruitment process, you can actually see unconscious bias have an impact everywhere. So, for example, if in your organization you deal with customers, there can be unconscious bias in terms of who it is that we choose to help, how we treat certain people. So anytime we're interacting with somebody, there is a potential of unconscious bias to play a role in that. This can also be prevalent in the teams that we work with. So when we're working with team members, there might be unconscious biases that are at play. And really for us, it's important to build that self-awareness piece.
All right, great. And you mentioned something about 3 U's earlier in the presentation, and one of our members, D-Center, wants to see if you could repeat what you were saying about those 3 U's. It seems he'd like to get a little bit more detail.
Absolutely. So all of my work is grounded in what I like to call the 3 U's. And the 3 U's are understanding self, understanding others, and understanding context. So I always say that we cannot begin to understand others without first understanding ourselves. And all of these 3 U's are interdependent. So we want to build that self-awareness piece, and then that will allow us to understand others. And we do that also through empathy-driven dialogue. And understanding context is just as important. So what might work in one context may not work in a different context. So understanding those variables is critical, especially as leaders when we're making decisions.
And it is so important to make good decisions, so that's some really good advice. So we want to dig into some recommendations that you can make. Dana would like to know your thoughts on how you can how you can help HR management make a case to executive teams to implement implicit bias training in the workplace.
That is an excellent question, and I get that question often. And really what we want to talk about when it comes to training is we don't want to pitch just a webinar or a seminar. A lot of times we find that that is ineffective. And so if we can approach the executives or those that are making the decisions with a plan on how it will be implemented multi-level and what the results could look like, I think that is very powerful. What I also recommend is experience, to allow those that are making the decisions to experience the training and to go through things like the riddles and the videos and to understand that they themselves hold implicit bias or unconscious bias. And once we experience it ourselves, I find that we're more likely to gain buy-in that way, and we're more likely to sign up in that way. So I would say to create a multi-level strategy, that is critical. And to show that this is multifaceted, and it's not just about doing one seminar or one webinar or one workshop. It's looking at unconscious bias holistically. And the second piece is to allow them to experience it themselves and then make the decision from there.
Yeah, great advice. Now let's revisit a video that you mentioned. Kathy wants to know the video that you mentioned that turned the journalist's kids invade an interview. I know this one on BBC on its head. She wants to know where she can find that.
The BBC video?
Yep.
Okay, so at the bottom of the slide deck, there is a link to that. You can actually Google BBC Live Interview with Kids, and all of the videos will pop up. But this one I found on Metro UK, and it was on the metro.co.uk website, and the title of the video was BBC Live Interview Goes Horribly Wrong as Children Interrupt Their Dad. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks for answering that. I think that no matter how many times I see that video, it still makes me laugh when the child in the yellow comes walking in, just thinking that he's joining the party. It's great. And so then another piece that we'd like to revisit where our members can find this, Elissa wants to know about an unconscious bias self-assessment questionnaire that you talked about, and she wants to know where we can access the questionnaire.
Excellent question. So if you Google Harvard's implicit association test, now there is a Canadian version and an American version, so you can pick whichever one wherever you are located geographically. And so it's just the Harvard's implicit association test, and there's a free demo online. You can choose between different areas and test yourself, and it's actually pretty fascinating in terms of the results.
All right, great. That should be helpful to find.
Great.
And so let's talk a little bit about the workplace culture and unconscious bias. Jacqueline would like to know, how do you tease out workplace culture from unconscious bias? Or is workplace culture part of what needs to be re-examined?
That is excellent. And yes, workplace culture, I mean, unconscious bias can feed into it. So I would see them as two separate things, but understanding that they are interconnected. So when we think about workplace culture, there are so many things that contribute to a culture of an organization. The people that are involved, the way the organization presents itself, the processes, the programs, the procedures, all of that contributes to the culture. And when we look at unconscious bias, we want to understand, well, how is it feeding into the culture? What assumptions are we making here in our organization that feed into the culture? And what is it that we agree with, or what is it that we do need to work on? And I think understanding the difference between that and then asking ourselves those key questions on how to address it can help in looking at the culture of an organization.
All right, great insight on that. So we'll move on to Kelly's question, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper into maybe of an approach. Kelly wants to know, could you provide recommendations on how to approach a manager and to begin a dialogue on unconscious bias?
Oh, absolutely. What's interesting is it's getting that buy-in piece is what I'm kind of seeing as a theme throughout these questions. I would actually send the implicit association test in an email and say, hey, this is a great test, have a look at it, and get them to do it. And maybe that can start that dialogue around unconscious bias and implicit association. I would also send the New York Times videos and just say, approach it from a light point of view, saying that this is really interesting, have a look at it. And I find that when we approach things in that way, people sometimes tend to be a little bit more open, as opposed to saying, we need to do this, this is very important, and this is why. That is also a great approach and can work for certain people, but for some people it doesn't. So if you are having a hard time in terms of getting buy-in or being able to approach people to start that dialogue, I would send them resources. Have them have a look at it for themselves. This is such a fascinating topic. Like if you learn about the studies, even the few that we spoke about in the webinar, it's fascinating. It's fascinating to assume that only 14% of Boston University students and 15% of children picked the mother as the surgeon. And for me, just that riddle alone was so eye-opening. Doing the implicit association test was very eye-opening. And I think if we send these resources to the people that we want to start that conversation with, it will help us to begin that conversation.
All right, thank you. And I think I must have gotten my questions mixed up just a touch. The next question actually comes from Kelly, not the one that I just read. But she wants to know, what about the notion of meritocracy and that talent will rise regardless of biases that others hold about us? Is that true?
That is very interesting. So when we look at meritocracy, it's holding kind of that idea that people are selected based on their ability. However, what we want to look at is whether or not there are some assumptions above that. So are we assuming that they have specific abilities? And also, are we ignoring people that may have those abilities, but we've made assumptions about them? And so, Holly, I'm going to ask you to repeat the question because I want to ensure that I'm responding to it correctly.
Yep.
Is that okay?
Yeah. So is it true when it comes to the notion of meritocracy and that talent will rise regardless of biases that others hold about us?
I personally don't agree with that at all. I think assumptions and biases can hold people back. I think assumptions and biases and unconscious bias can create conditions within organizations that actually hinder individuals to rise to the top or to get promotions or to be able to exercise their abilities. So I personally would disagree with that, and I think it's critical for us to look at the assumptions that are in place that might be hindering other people and what it is that they can achieve.
Thanks for that input. So let's turn things into, let's shed a positive light on this concept of unconscious bias. Aaron wants to know if it can actually be an asset or a positive thing to an organization.
Is the question that if unconscious bias is an asset, or if we were to address it, would that be an asset?
Can unconscious bias also be an asset or a positive thing?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I think when we think about unconscious bias, and when I do my research around that, there is so much that comes up. Things like affinity bias, pessimism bias, and a lot of it comes from this idea of ignorance and not knowing and not understanding, which is okay. We don't know what we don't know. Now, what's interesting about this is our biases, they lead to how it is that we view the world. Now, we can have had certain experiences that shape how we view the world, and we may have had very positive experiences. So we might think that everything is fantastic and great, and everyone is trustworthy and honest, but we want to be careful with that, right? So we want to understand that with unconscious bias, there's so much information that we can take in at any given moment. The research says at 11 million bits. If we're only taking in 40 and we're relying on our mental models, we want to see where those gaps are. Can it be an asset or a positive thing? I think it depends. It depends on what it is that we're looking at. Is it a positive thing in the recruitment process? I would say no. Is it a positive thing when we're interacting with others? It depends on if we're treating people differently. If we are treating people differently based on certain things or certain attributes, I would say no. So I think that question, I would approach it from the perspective that it really does depend, and it depends on the situation.
And you're right, things can change going from situation to the other. So let's spend some time talking about maybe the undoing of these biases. You mentioned earlier that you can actually de-learn your bias. How can you explain that a little further and help us understand how?
Absolutely. It's continuing to ask yourself key questions. So understanding whenever you're in a situation and saying, okay, well, what am I assuming about this situation, or what am I assuming about this person, or what am I assuming about what's in front of me? So I mentioned in my brief personal intro that I did travel to Ecuador, and I was in very rural communities while I was there. And I had some assumptions of the education system. I had assumptions on certain recommendations that should have been made, or I thought should have been made. And when I stepped foot in these communities, I recognized and saw that my recommendations would have been detrimental. The context was very different than what I was used to, or what I had grown up with. And for me, I had to de-learn my biases in order to relearn why I was there in the first place. And so I had to take a step back and say, okay, why am I here? Am I here to share my recommendations and what I think should happen in terms of education? Well, no, that's not why I'm there. I was there to help. So by relearning why I was there and asking myself, okay, what is important here, I was able to step back from what I assumed and what I was bringing to that situation. And I needed that, and I needed to build trust with that community before anything else. And that was really life-changing for me. It really showed me that I do have biases and assumptions that I bring with me to every situation. And if I want to be helpful, I need to put that aside. So what we can do for ourselves in order to de-learn and relearn is we want to take a step back sometimes and say, okay, could I be wrong? what am I assuming about the situation? What am I assuming about this specific group? And sometimes it is a matter of speaking to that specific group or individuals and gaining their experiences and or gaining an understanding of their experiences. And that's what we talk about when we talk about empathy-driven dialogue. It is so critical to understanding others and also de-learning our own biases. That understanding piece is a key component. And I hope that helps to answer that question.
All right, thanks, Ramit. We'll finish with one question to, I guess, leave us on a positive note as far as if you could tell us one thing to end this presentation about what you would recommend that we can personally do to address unconscious bias. What would that one thing be?
That's an easy one. And I have to say, Holly, these have been incredible questions. So thank you to the audience for submitting them. I would say to build self-awareness. And heightened self-awareness is key. And we can do that in so many different ways. There are assessments, there are tools, but always just going back to ourselves and understanding, okay, well, what experiences are shaping how it is that I'm viewing the situation? Or what is it about this situation that's triggering X, Y, or Z? And that self-awareness piece is so important, and we can continue to evolve and to grow if we engage in heightened self-awareness.
All right, great point. Well, guys, we have had plenty of other questions come in. However, we have come to the time where we have to wrap up our material for today. These questions will all go to Ramit for her to answer, so rest assured you won't be left behind. And also, please feel free to continue this discussion on Twitter. Use that hashtag HCIChat. And I'll say one more thank you to Ramit today, and also everyone else at MHS for making the webcast possible. And to all of our members out there, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy day to spend with us. Remember to take a look at those upcoming HCI events by clicking the Attend a Conference link at the top of the page. And we do look forward to seeing all of you participate in another HCI learning opportunity soon. And have a great day, everyone.